Welcome back, everyone. This is one of those times where I wish we were coming to you on a video screen, because that's what it takes to fully appreciate what our next guest, Dr. Beau Lotto, has to share with us about the power of perception and just generally the work that he does. So, Beau, it's great to be with you.
Nice to be with you.
Let me first join the millions to express my appreciation to you for challenging my perception. Since I was initially introduced to your first TED video, I want to say about three or 4 years ago, I think, Beau. Here was the big aha for me. If perception does really, and I believe it, drive everything, how come it's taken so long for us to truly understand it?
To understand perception?
Yeah.
Because to understand perception is to understand how the brain works and to understand what it is to be human. And it's a question we've been asking for, as you say, hundreds of years. And we really are a long way from understanding how the brain works. And a lot of it is the reason is grounded in our false assumptions of what the brain is actually trying to achieve. That assumption is often that the brain is trying to see the world as it really is. It's trying to construct reality. And so if that's true, then you try to explore the brain, you try to explore perception with that framework. Instead, we're thinking that maybe the brain didn't evolve to see the world as it is at all. In fact, it's impossible to see it as it is. And maybe it's even useless to see it as it is. So rather, we think the brain is there to construct meaning. That meaning is not necessarily what exists, it's what was useful to see. When you have that framework, you start thinking about the mechanisms and the strategies and the concepts differently. And more generally, you can think about it like the brain is a code, and the structure of the brain is a code. And if you want to understand a code, you have to make some assumptions, because otherwise the search space is too large. So you have to constrain that search space. So your assumptions are fundamental to deciphering a code. And the argument is that we've been having the wrong assumptions, or at least our assumptions have been too narrow.
What's missing, Beau?
What's missing? I think it was something that everyone has known for a long time, but it hasn't been really made explicit, or it hasn't been taken to maybe the extreme that it needs to be taken, which is the concept of uncertainty. So to say that the brain deals with uncertainty is to say something that everyone else has said as well. But to say that that is the problem that the brain evolved to solve is maybe something that's been missing. Because as soon as you think that that is the problem, then you're trying to figure out how the brain deals with that, and also the consequences of having a brain that actually evolved to deal with uncertainty.
Is it because we fear uncertainty? I mean, just as a human nature, I don't know a lot of people who don't fear it, but by and large, the population does fear not knowing.
So you think you know a lot of people that don't fear uncertainty?
Few. I know few.
Yeah, few. Right. Yeah, I agree. Actually, I'd say that we all do. I'd say everyone hates uncertainty. In fact, it's almost a biological principle. As I say in the talks, if you're not sure there's a predator, it's too late. So the brain evolved to take what is uncertain and make certainty out of it. Why? Because at every moment in time, I have to make a decision. I can't just stand still, or in fact, standing still is itself a decision. So if the brain is always having to do something, it has to base that behavior on a perception, on something that it predicts to be useful. So the problem is the information that it's got to deal with is itself inherently ambiguous. So even in the most extreme case, the light that falls onto our eye, or the waves that fall into our ears, or the touch on our skin, all that information doesn't actually tell us what to do. It's literally meaningless, because it could literally mean anything. So the brain can't rely on that information, because that information also not only does it not tell us what to do, it doesn't even correlate with what's actually in the real world. So the only other piece of information the brain can use to generate a useful behavior is what that stuff meant for behavior in the past.
And that leaves impressions a lot of times that become permanent. And that's where I start to see lots of people get crippled because of some of those impressions that, of something that has happened in the past that holds them back from moving forward.
Yeah, that's right. So, and I think it's because, of course, what they're doing when they create that perception is what they're doing is they're creating a meaning for that behavior, a meaning for that information. And it's always that meaning that we're seeing. So the point is that we are so fundamentally tied to taking this uncertain information, trying to make it certain, that we literally hate that space. And as I've often said, that seasickness is a consequence of uncertainty. Most of if you're down below in a boat and your eyes are telling you you're standing still, your ears are telling you're moving, that's why you literally get ill. Your brain can't deal with that conflict. So most of our mental, emotional health is a consequence, or illness is a consequence of dealing with uncertainty. The irony is that that's the only space that we can go in order to do something different. And so my guess is that those few people that you say enjoy uncertainty are possibly the people that you find to be most creative.
They are most creative, and they're the ones who tend to gravitate more towards Eastern philosophies of meditation, mindfulness. I'm not connected to my thinking, I'm not connected to my feeling kind of people.
That's interesting. Yeah. So, right. I'm not quite sure. Yeah.
Those are, they feel like, I think you almost have to be at that state. Well, you also say, Beau, that one of the things to start really understanding maybe our brain is to start asking questions, start asking really interesting, provocative questions like you teach the children to do. What does just the mere fact of asking questions do to our mind?
The asking a question is to say, I don't know. So which means to ask a question is to step into uncertainty. What matters as far as asking questions, because most people say asking questions is important, that's kind of the first step of creativity. But what people don't really necessarily explore is why, which is the question you're asking. And there's also the concept that any question is a good question, which I think is also not correct. I think, in fact, it could be most questions are bad questions or useless questions. It's really interesting, without repeating the word too many times, question, to ask what makes a good one. So what happens when your brain asks a question? It's stepping into uncertainty, and it's in a sense saying, could things be different from the way they are now? So whenever you make a decision, there's a range of possibility. Some are more likely and some are less likely. That range of possibility is determined by what your assumptions are. What happens when you ask a question, especially if you're questioning your assumptions, is you change the range of possibilities. You are making more things or different things more likely and other things less likely. The consequence of that is you have the possibility of putting things together that were previously separate. What the brain is really good at is finding relationships. And it's more likely to find relationships between things, concepts, objects, information that is next to each other than are far apart, either literally or metaphorically. So when you ask a question, basically what you're doing is you're changing your search space.
Interesting. So let me turn it back to you then. Tell me what makes a good question. Because I agree with you here. I hear a lot, ask dumb questions, ask dumb questions, ask dumb questions. But why? Dumb questions are dumb questions, with all due respect to the people who say that.
What makes a good question? I think you can answer that, and I don't know, actually, is the honest answer. But we have some views. I think possibly what the best questions are the hardest ones to ask, first of all. The best questions are the ones that challenge our most core beliefs. They're hard to ask for two reasons. One, we don't know what our core beliefs are. We don't know what our assumptions are. They're often hidden from us, especially the assumptions that we inherit. So to discover those, to know what our core assumptions are is very hard, so we don't know how to question them. The other problem is, even if you did know, to question them is to actually step into the deepest form of uncertainty, which is to almost question your identity. These are the things that sort of determine who you are and why you do what you do. So that's sort of the deepest level of uncertainty. So those are a couple of reasons why, what makes a good question. Another way to think about asking a good question is, and what defines a good question is, it's what, let's see, how do I describe this? A good question leads on to other questions. So one that is, if you think about a network of questions, one that is highly connected to lots of other questions. Imagine a question just leads to one other. That's not nearly as interesting that a question leads into 100 of others.
Beau, how do we train ourselves to ask better questions? Like, how do you do it, for example? Because you're around this world of creativity. You're involved in lots of opportunities that come your way. How do you become better at that? Is it a skill?
I think it is. I think, I don't know if skill is the right word, but I think it does come with practice. At least the phrase I'm using at the moment is that there's nothing creative about creativity. And the reason for suggesting that is that asking questions, challenging your assumptions, or put a different way, that creativity, people often think is linked to, it's a particular type of person. It's an artist. It's not me. I can't be creative. It's an inspiration. It's the light bulb idea. It just suddenly happens. It's not really understandable. It's fairly random. If that's true, then you can't really train someone to be creative. You just maybe have to create the right context, or you just have to pretend to be like Picasso. But actually, if creativity is a process, then that's something you can create a framework around and in a sense, not necessarily teach people, but show people how it can be done. And this is actually one of the things that we're trying to do. So I think it is a skill. Fundamental to that skill is to create the space where asking questions is a positive thing. That's often what doesn't happen in things like school or businesses or spaces that are ironically are thought to be creative.
Because sometimes there's a fear. Obviously, with kids, you demonstrate it probably every day. You demonstrated at the talk last year, Ted, when you brought out the young girl. But there is a fear for a child to ask a teacher a question, number one. And in most businesses, I would say probably more the more established companies and the emerging companies, Beau, where there is a hierarchy. Somebody who's down 5 notches below the leaders aren't supposed to ask questions. They never even see the leader.
It's true. Well, I assume that to be true because fortunately I don't exist in such situations. But right. So there is a fear of asking questions. If you take if you take both education and business, I think they're actually two ends of the same continuum, and I think actually you can't transform without transforming the other. So why is asking questions, in a sense, a bad thing to do in business? The reason, it seems, is that businesses are very interested in innovation, of course. And there are two ingredients to any innovation. There's efficiency and there's creativity. Those are the two components that make up any innovation. So as Jobs said, it's creativity that ships. So businesses, what they tend to focus on is only one side of that equation, which is efficiency. Now, in biology, efficiency is hugely important. If you have two animals trying to solve the same problem and one does it faster or more efficient than the other, it'll survive. The problem is that creativity is seen as not being very efficient. That actually could be a misconception. It could be actually that creativity enables a business to be more efficient, not only in the long term, but in the intermediate term, and potentially even in the short term. Because what companies tend to do is they'll be presented with a problem, they'll come up with a good strategy, potentially a very creative strategy to solve that problem. Now they're presented with a new problem. What they use is what we call metaphor, i.e. they take the same solution and they apply it to this new problem. And it might be somewhat effective. And as a result, they stick with that solution. And then what they do is they now have a hammer and they apply the same rule, the same strategy to every single problem they come up with. That solution becomes increasingly inefficient. What they need to do is now challenge their assumptions, come up with new solutions for these new problems. As a result, they will be more efficient solutions. Right? But there's a process where you actually have to, in a sense, take a step back. The same problem exists in education, but that's a different question.
Beau, do you find that there is maybe a pattern or a framework of questions that lead to this network of questions? Like when you are working with children in particular, do you start to get them to start thinking from that framework when asking and making assumptions?
Yes. There's a process that I go through in working with kids. We call it the iScientist program, but it's a generalized framework. The first thing we do in order to inspire kids to ask questions is, because no one's going to ask a question if you don't have a sense of wonder or curiosity. So the first thing we want to do is inspire, create a sense of wonder. And if you have wonder, now you're going to say, I wonder why. So we first start with the question. Once we give an inspiration, a sense of wonder, the next step is to ask the question why. And often children, and in fact everyone, think that the most interesting questions are very complex. And often children are actually, ironically, especially in the context of a classroom, aren't used to asking questions. I've had children, when I said, just come up with a question, I've had children cry because they actually get frustrated because they think they're supposed to come up with either something really, really complex and therefore interesting, or they just aren't practiced at asking questions at all, which is actually incredibly sad when you think about that this is happening in a classroom. So we'll go through a process of description and then turning that description into questions. So that is big. Why is it big? That is yellow. Why is it yellow? So then they start getting to that practice of asking questions. The next stage is to get them to ask a question that really matters to them. What's something that you really care about, as opposed to just any question? And then we try to get at the basics of what that is. The next step after why is to get them to ask the question, what if? Well, what if I did this? What if I did that? Now you're in the realm of actually creating an experiment. And the final stage is to get them to then observe what happens when they apply the what if. And in fact, there's a next step after that, which is to share that information. That's actually basically the scientific process.
Beau, what is the lesson here for entrepreneurs who are listening, who are building businesses? And obviously, as you know, building any business is always a learn in progress. We try, we do, we learn, we refine. In just this whole notion of asking questions, what's the lesson there?
What's the question for entrepreneurs? What's the question for businesses?
What's the lesson? What's the big lesson for entrepreneurs to learn from inspiring this environment and culture where questions are part of the business?
That's a very good one. I think there can be some very general lessons, and actually we're increasingly thinking about what the specific, more applied answer to that question is. So one of them is about the culture. That in order to, fundamental to a creative space and the environment in which this happens. And in fact, you can think about leadership in this context as well. There are 3 attributes of what defines a good leader. These attributes, so if you ask someone what makes a good leader, I have a slide that shows, people come up with 20, 25 different attributes. Only 3 of them are correlated with the actual value of a company. Those 3 actually, I think, define what I personally think is a good leader, which is someone who is able to lead others into uncertainty. They create the space that enables people to step on uncertainty. They're able to step into uncertainty themselves. And there's lots of thinking for what that space might or might not be. There's also another example where, for instance, diversity of groups is essential in thinking about how we can be more creative. Why are groups important? One reason might be that groups enable us to challenge the assumptions that we didn't know we had, because people bring different perspectives. So it's almost an accidental way of challenging assumptions. There are many, I think, different types of lessons we can apply, but a lot of it has to do with what I call the ecology of creativity.
Let me go back to uncertainty for a second. Just from your work, have you seen a correlation that connects fear with uncertainty? Because that's what's keeping most people stuck.
Yeah. But how do you mean? I mean, it's a correlation in what sense?
Well, you can look at uncertainty one of two ways, right? We can look at it as bad things are going to happen, or we can get into that mystery that great things are going to happen, and I just need to go through the process to get there. It seems to me that the great majority of people fear uncertainty because of the negative potential consequences, as opposed to enjoying the mystery.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Now, that has to do with the environment, and that's where, in the second TED Talk, I talk about, in a sense, that's what I call science, and that's what I call science as a way of being. So as you say, uncertainty can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing. It can be perceived as a good thing or a bad thing. And usually, as you say, it's more often not perceived as a bad thing. The argument is that there's only really one human endeavor where uncertainty is actually a good thing. And that human endeavor is science. Now, I mean science in a different way than maybe most people or some people will be thinking about it. I don't mean science as a process or as a method. I mean science as a way of being. So what is that way of being? It's this way of being that celebrates uncertainty. It's open to diversity. It loves possibility. It creates possibility. It's collaborative. It's something we do because we enjoy it for the sake of it. And actually, ironically, whereas society tends to see science as a platform for decreasing society's uncertainty, actually science is there to increase it. And when you think about science in this way, there's another way of describing it, which is play, because all those descriptors of science are also descriptors of play. So people who study play will tell you that that's, in a sense, what defines play. So that is what I think is a route towards getting people to step into uncertainty.
Well, celebrate it, like you say, right, and be adaptable to change.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question about creativity, because you triggered something in my mind. Again, here's another thing. We feel that, at least perception-wise, that most people fear uncertainty because of the negative consequences. The overwhelming majority of society, at least the people that I'm around, a lot of them feel that they don't have a creative bone in their body. Why is it that people feel they're not creative when, in essence, they haven't dug deep enough to find something that they're creative at?
So why do people not feel they're creative? That's an interesting question. I mean, I think it's possible. I suppose there could be a number of answers, of course, but maybe one is because we have a particular view of what a creative output is. That creativity is specific to certain sort of endeavors like art, or science, and creativity in the way I design my house, or the way I live my life, or the way I buy my groceries, or the way I do my accountancy, aren't seen as creative. But actually, I'd suggest that that isn't true at all. Creativity is really just about seeing differently. And so people in relationships can be incredibly creative. They can be incredibly creative in the way they see themselves. So I think the potential for creativity is massive. It's very possible that people are much more creative than they think they are. Maybe the barrier to it is not just that they attribute creativity only to certain modalities, but that the fear that they don't allow themselves the opportunity to ask questions about themselves in their own life, because to do so is so incredibly scary. It's much more, it feels much safer to live a more stable, predictable life.
Is that why it's easier, Beau, for us to look and critique the outside world than it is for us to really get inside? I mean, that's a conscious decision that we make, to look at others and not to take the same effort to look at our own lives.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's much harder to look at yourself than to look at others. In fact, there's a new study showing that we're much better at predicting other people's behavior than we are predicting our own. And why? Because we're more able to see that people can be more plastic and contextual than we are ourselves. So to ask questions of yourselves is very hard, because you're challenging who you think you are. And there aren't maybe enough people who are willing to ask those questions.
So 2 more questions for you. Speaking of questions, I want to get your perspective on failure, because it's tough for people to recover from past missteps. Yet, again, I look at this as a perception. How do you deal with this whole notion of failure? Because, hey, lots of entrepreneurs, not everything we touch succeeds.
Actually, yeah. So that's a good question. And I'm not necessarily the good person to ask, because I'm a bit pathological in that sense, and that I see failures as, and this is going to sound like a cliche, so I'm really sorry about that, but I tend to see, I like to try to see failures as opportunities and possibilities. And in fact, conflict, if approached in the right way, is an opportunity. And of course, we know in science that you only learn through what's called a failure. So you might create a model, what's called an ideal observer, and it's only interesting when something deviates from that. So when things deviate from what you predict is going to happen. So to me, and again, it sounds like a cliche, but failures are opportunities. And I would love to somehow rebrand failure, and rebrand success in the opposite direction. So, yeah, I'm not sure that answers the question.
Well, no, it gives me a perception. So I want to end with this. You make big bets in your life, right? You bet on children that, most other people probably wouldn't take chances to bring a young 12-year-old person on a stage in front of millions of people. You bet on big projects. You're betting on one right now. How do you get that conscious tolerance to make big bets knowing there's a hell of a lot of uncertainty?
That makes me scared, actually. I didn't think of it that way. Shit.
Well, don't think about it that way. Tell me how you think about it.
Maybe that's my strategy, is not to think about it. I suppose you could turn that around, and you could say maybe it's more of a risk not to. Maybe it's more of a risk to not take risk, because what you're going to end up doing is living in a space that isn't interesting, isn't challenging, isn't creative, isn't fulfilling. And so, in fact, the same can be true with companies, for instance. They die if they don't take risks. And similarly, life is about movement and constant movement, and there's risk in that. But maybe the greater risk is in not doing anything. So for me, I suppose I don't see them so much as risks, but maybe I should. So that's kind of a rubbish answer, but there you go.
Beau, you're a huge inspiration for those who are not fully aware of the depth of the work that you do. Could you just share with them, how do they learn more about all the work that you do, and point them in the direction where they can find more about some of the projects you're engaged in?
Well, I suppose the most obvious place to go is to the lab's website. That seems a very stereotypical answer. So at lottolab.org. So that's where we try to feature most of the work when we have time to keep it up to date. And our work is very general. And we have lots of different projects, from a Silicon Valley startup to a new magazine to basic science experiments to education programs. And it does actually seem very diverse, but actually it's maybe not as diverse as it seems, because I'd argue that really there's only one thing being said. It's just being said and explored in different ways.
And is that message, get out there and try things? Is that kind of the core message of all of this?
Get out there and try things. Actually, it's sort of, the message would be something like, be afraid. In other words, actually celebrate being afraid. In other words, step into uncertainty and try to create the space that enables you, and maybe far more importantly, enables others to step into that space.
Well, you've given everybody an invitation. I appreciate your time, and I hope that we will continue this conversation and keep a close eye on how we can create that space around you. So thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.